The first time Derek Lawson said the words, "When I built this strategy," it did not register as sound. It registered as a break in physics. I was sitting near the end of the long walnut conference table on the 14th floor with a leather folio open in front of me, and a bottle of water I had not touched since the meeting began. And for one clean, suspended second, it felt as if every object in the room had become more solid while I had become less real. The screen behind him glowed with a slide I had built at 1:38 in the morning 3 weeks earlier, while the office lights over my row had shut off twice from lack of motion, and I had waved an arm in the dark like someone begging a machine not to forget she was still there. The chart was mine, the structure was mine, the language was mine, even down to the phrasing in the subtitle where I had tried for 20 minutes to decide whether false loyalty was too aggressive for leadership, and then left it in because it was the only phrase that told the truth. Derek stood at the head of the room in a navy suit that made him look expensive in the careful, controlled way he liked to look expensive. One hand lightly resting on the table, the other clicking through the deck with the relaxed tempo of a man who believed the room belonged to him before he entered. Across from him, the COO leaned forward. The CFO had her reading glasses halfway down her nose. The executive sponsor on the account had already nodded twice. Derek let a faint, polished smile touch his mouth and said, "When I built this strategy, the first thing I realized was that we were solving the wrong problem." There was a pause after that, not long, not dramatic, but long enough for the room to receive the sentence and settle around it like fresh cement. Nobody looked at me. Nobody said my name. Nobody asked who had run the analysis, who had rebuilt the model, who had spent nights inside broken retention data until a pattern emerged. Derek clicked to the next slide and continued in the first person. I pulled the cohorts apart and found that what looked like stability was actually front-loaded false confidence. My throat went dry so fast it hurt. I knew the exact notebook tab where that idea had first appeared, because I had typed it after midnight with my wrists aching from hunching over the keyboard. He clicked again. I decided we needed to stop treating churn as an end-state problem and start treating it as a sequencing problem. My fingers curled under the edge of my folio hard enough to leave nail marks in the leather. He had not just taken the work, he had taken the path to it. That was what made it different from ordinary managerial vanity. He was not standing in front of the room, saying my team did great work, and failing to name me. He was narrating my thinking, as if it had originated in his mind. He was appropriating process. He was claiming authorship. The screen changed to the recommendation page, the one I had rewritten 6 times because the original version felt too cautious, and the second felt too academic, and the third sounded like I was apologizing for being right. Derek turned slightly toward the CFO and said, "So I rebuilt the strategic frame from the ground up." The CFO smiled. "This is strong," she said. "Very strong." Derek gave a modest shrug that landed exactly where he meant it to land, between competence and restraint. "It took some work," he said. People around the table gave the low, approving sounds executives make when a story has already decided who the hero is. I felt the blood drain out of my face and then rush back too hot. It was not confusion anymore. It was not one sloppy sentence. It was not one omitted credit line that could be explained away later as pressure or oversight, or the rough edges of collaboration. He had prepared this narrative. He had practiced it. He had walked into the room planning to turn my labor into his career capital, in front of the people whose opinions actually changed titles. The realization hit with such precision that it made me calmer, not because I was okay, but because shock was giving way to a harder substance. If I stayed silent in that room, then what he was saying would become the official version. The false timeline would harden. His words would become memory. And memory in offices like ours was more powerful than truth when truth lived only in the hands of the person below you. 3 months earlier, when the account first landed on my desk as a vague management handoff disguised as opportunity, Derek had sent me a message at 6:11 p.m. with the subject line, "First Pass." The body of the email was 4 sentences long. The client retention trend looked off. The leadership team wanted a strategic hypothesis before the quarter closed. Could I take a first pass and see if there was a real signal there? That was how large, invisible amounts of work entered my life. Through tiny, polite requests that sounded temporary and exploratory until they consumed nights and weekends, and began reorganizing my nervous system around them. The account was already politically charged. It belonged to one of our highest-paying enterprise clients. The kind of client leadership talked about in terms of relationship equity and board visibility and renewal optics. The surface story coming from the account team was familiar and wrong in the way corporate stories often are when they are built under pressure. Competitive market, buyer fatigue, pricing sensitivity, broader softness in the category, all the explanations that sounded respectable because they spread responsibility so widely no one inside the company had to feel defective. I started in the raw exports because I never trusted summary dashboards when something smelled too clean. The first few nights gave me nothing except fatigue and irritation. The data did not merely resist interpretation. It lied in orderly ways. Cohorts that looked stable at 30 days collapsed at 90. Onboarding satisfaction metrics were high in segments where expansion later cratered. Counts that renewed once with ease quietly hollowed out from usage deterioration, long before anyone flagged them at the relationship level. I worked late every night that week. The office changed after 7:00 p.m. People who stayed late in movies always look intense and glamorous, but real offices after dark feel slightly abandoned and a little humiliating, full of cold, recycled air and humming vents, and the smell of old coffee burned into carpet. I would heat leftovers in the break room and eat standing up, because sitting felt like surrender. I built an exploratory model first, then broke it down, then rebuilt it because the structure I had started with was too close to how the business already talked about churn, and the business was clearly wrong. By the second week, I had a pattern. It was ugly and incredibly specific. What looked like loyalty was mostly onboarding friction disguised as engagement. Customers were oversupported early, then undertransferred once the relationship changed hands, creating a short-term illusion of health followed by a delayed collapse that our dashboards interpreted too late. It was not just a risk problem, it was an attribution problem. The company was congratulating the wrong stage and ignoring the stage that actually determined survival. Once I saw it, I could not unsee it. I built a new framework around sequence, handoff points, activation depth, and disguised attrition. I wrote a memo to force the logic to hold in sentences, because if analysis could not survive prose, it would die in the room where decisions got made. I built the first draft of the deck on a Thursday night, then tore half of it apart on Friday because the recommendations were too soft. I kept local copies of everything out of habit. Excel model, notebook exports, the first deck labeled V1, the second labeled V1. 2. A notes document where I tracked hypotheses that failed and why. At the time, I thought I was simply doing rigorous work. I did not understand I was also, without knowing it, building the future skeleton of a case file. Derek's involvement in that early period was almost insultingly thin. He was visible in the way senior managers often are visible when the labor is still uncertain. He stopped by my desk twice, once with coffee in hand and once with his phone still in his palm, and asked questions that signaled engagement without requiring actual effort. What's the story underneath the story? Are we seeing economics or process? What does leadership need to believe before they can act? He loved asking questions that sounded like altitude. He had spent years learning how to translate other people's detail into executive-flavored abstraction, and the skill made him look smarter than he was to people who did not watch him closely enough. When I first showed him the rough framework, he stood beside my monitor and stared with theatrical concentration, the kind that looked respectful until you realized he was absorbing language more than substance. "Interesting," he said. "This is a little too tactical right now, but the bones are good." He said bones the way another man might say raw material. He asked for the editable files so he could refine for execs. That phrase should have made me pause longer than it did. It did make me pause for a second, just enough to feel something faint and cold move under my ribs. Not suspicion exactly, more like a misalignment I could not name. I told myself not to be dramatic. He was my manager. Of course, he wanted the editable versions. Of course, leadership materials would go through him. That was the structure. I sent the Excel workbook, the notebook export, the memo draft, and the deck. 10 minutes later, he replied, "Got it. I'll polish." Nothing about the work itself, nothing about the insight, no questions about the logic in the model, just possession and a casual promise to improve. The first time he tested the waters of theft, it was verbal and deniable. In an internal meeting with 2 directors and the client success lead, he said, "I realized we've been misreading the early retention curve. then proceeded to explain the exact distinction I had built between front-loaded support and durable activation. He did not look at me while he spoke. He did not say Evelyn found. He did not say the analysis suggests. He said, I realized, and the room accepted that pronoun as if it had always belonged to him. I remember the client success lead nodding and saying, that makes a lot of sense, and one of the directors adding, this is why it helps to have someone zoom out. Zoom out. Derek loved that phrase, because it turned depth into smallness and distance into authority. After the meeting, I walked beside him toward the elevators and said as carefully as I could, that framework came directly from the model I built. He pressed the elevator button, glanced at me, and gave me the expression he would later use whenever he wanted to make me feel adolescent for noticing reality. It was patient and faintly disappointed. Evelyn, he said, we're not going to do line-by-line authorship on every strategic thought. That's not how this level works. The elevator doors opened. He stepped inside, then added, we're a team. He said it in the tone of someone offering wisdom. I stood there outside the doors feeling embarrassed, though I could not yet tell whether I was embarrassed for him or for myself. From there, the pattern thickened quickly, because once a person gets away with soft theft, hard theft begins to feel like a natural extension of their own entitlement. In meetings, Derek would paraphrase my findings in smoother, broader language, and then invite discussion before I had the chance to speak. When I did speak, he would restate my point in slightly altered words, and the room would orient toward him because titles create gravity. He began changing the naming of the work in channels and emails. What had been retention sequencing analysis became Derek's initiative in one Slack update posted by someone from operations who was almost certainly just following cues from above. I saw the phrase on my screen and felt my stomach tighten, so suddenly I had to sit back in my chair. It sounds absurd when described out of context. The idea that 2 words in a channel update could feel physically invasive. But language is where offices decide what is real. Narrative always starts with naming. Once the work had his name attached to it in common circulation, everyone around it began adjusting reflexively. Meeting requests shifted. The phrasing and follow-up notes changed. A director wrote, looking forward to seeing Derek's recommendation package, and another person replied with a thumbs up. My role narrowed in public even as it deepened in actual labor. Derek still needed me to build everything, so he kept me close operationally while pushing me away symbolically. He would drop comments into the deck at 9:45 p.m. that said things like, tighten logic here, on slides where the logic was already exact, forcing me to reopen work he barely understood just so his presence would exist inside the revision trail. He removed my speaking slot from an internal rehearsal and told me, I need a cleaner executive voice in the room. He praised my diligence in front of others with a softness that was almost tender and entirely strategic. Evelyn is great once she gets out of the weeds, he said once in a planning session, and people smiled because on the surface it sounded encouraging. Underneath, it turned me into a useful technician who required translation. The first time he presented the work publicly to leadership and received direct praise for it, I still hoped I could confront him privately and restore the line before it hardened permanently. That was the last stage of innocence, the belief that if I spoke plainly to the right person in the right room, the truth would reassemble itself. The one-on-one in his office cured me of that belief. He had the blinds half closed and his jacket hanging on the back of the chair, which always made him look more approachable in a way I came to understand was tactical. He preferred difficult conversations in settings that softened him visually. When I told him he had presented my work as if he had built it, he did not even pretend confusion. He sighed and leaned back as though disappointed by how small I was making the conversation. This is a team effort, he said first, because team effort is the corporate disinfectant men like him apply to theft once they are caught noticing themselves do it. I said, you said you built the strategy. He answered without blinking. Leadership is owning the narrative. Then he let the sentence sit there, as if he had offered a principle that more mature professionals would immediately understand. I said, owning the narrative is not the same as taking credit for analysis you didn't do. At that, something colder entered his face. Not rage. Rage would have been easier. He became quieter. I want you to hear yourself, he said. What I'm hearing is a very personal reaction to a standard executive dynamic. I said nothing because I could feel anger rising, and I had already started to understand that anger would be used against me. He folded his hands and continued in the calm, instructional tone he used. when he wanted cruelty to sound developmental. People who advance here understand that visibility and authorship are not the same thing. If you are framing this as someone stole my work, that tells me you are still thinking from an individual contributor mindset. The shame landed before the logic did, which is how gaslighting works when done by someone with status. Part of me knew exactly what he was doing. Another part felt 12 years old. I said more quietly, "You removed my name from the deck." He tilted his head. "I removed clutter from a leadership document. Do not confuse format decisions with ethical violations." I stared at him. He stared back with a patience so controlled it bordered on contempt. Then he added, "Be careful not to turn this into an ego issue. That can have professional consequences." The room did not get louder after he said that. It got softer. That was how he operated. He did not need overt threats. He understood that vague consequences are often more effective than explicit ones, because the target is forced to imagine the full range of damage. On my way back to my desk, I replayed the conversation and felt the first real fracture inside myself. I knew he was wrong. I also knew he was powerful enough to make wrongness expensive. For the next several days, I moved through the office in a state that was part anger, part disbelief, and part something I hated admitting even to myself. I was beginning to doubt not the facts, but my ability to survive naming them. Nobody stepped in. That was the next lesson, and maybe the more brutal one. Offices do not simply protect bullies because they are afraid. They protect them because so much of corporate stability depends on shared selective blindness. People had seen Derek absorb other people's labor before. You could tell in the way they spoke around him. They were careful in ways that indicated history. A woman from client operations stopped by my desk one afternoon to ask an ordinary question about a file format, then lingered 1 second too long and said very softly, without looking at me, "Check your files." She left before I could respond. Another colleague who had praised the analysis weeks earlier abruptly started referring to it as Derek's work in group settings. Not maliciously, almost automatically, because that was now the accepted current. Slack channels mirrored the shift. The project label changed. Meeting recaps attributed decisions upward. The psychological violence of that period came less from open attack than from repetition. Every day I watched the office rehearse the lie until it began to feel infrastructural. I would come home with my back aching from how tightly I held myself at work and sit in my apartment in the dark with my laptop open. Not even working, just staring at the screen as if stillness could prevent the whole thing from becoming irreversible. I stopped sleeping well. When I did sleep, I woke at 3, 0 or 4. 0 with unfinished conversations running in my head and a sensation of pressure in my chest like I had missed a step on a staircase in the dark. At work, Derek introduced new forms of control that were subtle enough to sound petty if listed, yet devastating in aggregate. He moved a prep meeting without telling me, then said, "I assumed you saw the update." He reassigned the presentation order so that I spoke only if someone asked a deeply technical question late in the discussion, then later told me, "I'm trying to protect you from overexposure before you're ready." He sent a late-night email revising the deck subject line from retention sequencing strategy to Derek Lawson proposal draft and acted as though it were administrative. He began calling me support in situations where he had once called me lead. He once asked me in front of 3 people to clean up formatting on a deck whose logic I had built from scratch. Everyone in the room knew formatting was not my job. No one said anything. I said yes. That yes haunted me afterward more than some of the bigger injuries. It was proof that he was not only taking the work, he was training me to participate in my own reduction. The first hard break in his control came the night I opened the live deck and saw my name gone, not just from the footer, but from the notes' history and authorship fields where it had once been visible in comments and suggestions. It happened after 10:00 p.m. The office was mostly empty. I had stayed late to prepare an implementation appendix he had asked for at 5:37 with the message, "Need sharper thinking here." I pulled up the deck and immediately felt something wrong in my body before I could articulate. Current file looked cleaner in a way that was not designed. It looked scrubbed. The author tag that used to appear in the collaboration history on certain pages no longer reflected how the document had been built. Several comments I had left for myself in early drafts were gone. The speaker note language had been minimally altered, but not enough to hide origin if someone compared versions carefully. That was when the whisper returned to me. "Check your files." I opened the local backup folder on my desktop The one I kept automatically because I never trusted cloud tools to preserve reasoning, only outputs. There it was. V1, 2, the original deck with my name attached in the internal author field. The notes as I had written them, the recommendation structure before Derek's edits. I laid the local version side by side with the live file and saw it clearly for the first time as an act rather than an atmosphere. Ownership had been edited, not blurred, not lost, edited deliberately. I did not cry. I did not explode. Something in me turned colder and more exact than emotion. I opened version history. At first it looked incomplete. There were gaps, consolidated edits, revisions renamed in bland management language, and a few comment threads that had clearly been resolved or cleaned. But version history, like most digital systems, is harder to kill completely than people assume. I clicked backward through snapshots, timestamp by timestamp, and began reconstructing the chain. My content appeared first under my account, then later under Derek's. The order was not ambiguous. The slide framework existed before his so-called strategic refinement. My models existed before his narrative claim. He had changed titles, stripped markers, deleted some internal notes, and inserted his fingerprints into the revision trail after the fact. But he had not created the work. He had stepped into it, dressed it, and declared parentage. Some of the history had been cleaned, but not enough. An older snapshot still carried my author metadata on key pages. A deleted comment thread still showed a time-stamped exchange between me and another analyst discussing a recommendation sequence days before Derek ever used the same phrasing in executive review. The software, quietly and without opinion, was telling the truth. Version history did not care about his title. Version history did not care how calm he sounded in room. Once I understood I was not crazy and not powerless, the nature of the pain changed. It stopped being soft and shapeless and became work. I started collecting. I built a private folder outside the team drive and named it Nothing Memorable. Inside, I created subfolders for deck history, model files, email trail, chat logs, meeting notes, calendar artifacts, and witness material. Then I started reconstructing the story as sequence. I went into email archives first. The earliest message was mine to Derek with the draft attachments and a long explanation of the logic behind the false loyalty interpretation. I had written that email carefully at the time because I wanted him to understand the structure, and now every careful explanatory sentence functioned like a time-stamped signature. His reply, "Got it, I'll polish," was almost insulting in its flatness. But farther down the chain, hidden inside a reply all from a later coordination thread, I found something stronger. In response to a scheduling note from operations, Derek had written, "Evelyn put together the initial framework. I'm tightening the strategic narrative before exec circulation." I stared at that sentence for a long time. It was not a confession, not exactly, but it was an acknowledgement. An acknowledgement meant he knew the truth at the exact time he was beginning to erase it publicly. Then the later messages appeared, the ones where he described the work in the first person. As I designed this, the model I built, my approach, the progression mattered. He had not merely fallen into loose language. There was a transition from knowing I built the framework to claiming he had built it himself. That transition was the lie. I exported everything. Then I moved to Slack. The company technically used it as a collaboration tool, but in practice it was an unofficial memory organ, full of first thoughts, timestamps, attachments, and accidental honesty. I searched key phrases from the strategy and found the thread where I first posted the cohort anomaly at 11:07 p.m. Writing, "I think we're measuring the wrong kind of stability here." Derek had reacted with the eyes emoji the next morning. Later I posted, "The onboarding sequence is masking actual risk. This may be the core story." There were replies from peers asking questions, responses from me clarifying the logic, and at least one direct note from Derek saying, "Good. Keep refining before we socialize." The record was there. Then I found meeting notes. In one internal prep doc, the action item next to my name read, "Evelyn to present strategic structure." In a later calendar invite for the same review, my name had been removed from presenter, and Derek's had been inserted. That mattered too, because calendar systems preserve invisible little brutalities people forget to hide. The more sources I combined, the less this looked like one contested act of credit, and the more it looked like a controlled appropriation with layers. File origin, revision sequencing, language shift, presentational displacement, public ownership claim. He had not stumbled into the spotlight. He had constructed the path there. Even with all that, I still could not move yet. Because evidence alone is not enough when the person you are accusing already has institutional fluency and a reputation for results. I needed corroboration, and that was harder. People who know the truth in these environments often protect themselves by converting their knowledge into vagueness. They say things like, "You know how he is," or "This happens," or "Be careful." What they will not do is attach their names to sequence. I began asking around carefully, not with accusations, but with pointed curiosity about old projects. I asked who had built certain frameworks now associated with Derek in Leadership Summary. I asked about an analyst who had left abruptly after a high-profile client recovery. I asked why a former team member's name appeared in early working files on one account, but vanished from all final materials. The answers came in fragments. That situation got messy. She was really strong, but I think there were politics. Honestly, Derek packages things well. It is complicated. Then one afternoon, when most of the floor was at lunch, a woman from another department paused by the coffee machine while I waited for the espresso to drip and said, still facing the machine, "He did it on Atlas too." My pulse jumped. "To who?" I asked. She shook her head once. "I'm not giving you that, but you're not the first." Then she picked up her cup and left me standing there with coffee I no longer wanted. That sentence changed the emotional geometry of the whole thing. Up to that point, I had been holding two ideas at once: that he had stolen from me, and that maybe I had somehow made myself stealable. Her words did not make the situation easier, but they removed the last of my private self-blame. This was a pattern. That meant there might be history. History meant mistakes. Men like Derek survive by controlling the emotional interpretation of their conduct, not by being flawless in execution. Somewhere there would be a person he had underestimated. That person, unexpectedly, was not one of his former analysts. It was a woman named Hannah who worked as an executive assistant, aligned loosely to his part of the organization. We were not close, but we knew each other in the quiet, professional way women in offices often know each other. We smiled in hallways, warned each other about calendar shifts, occasionally shared the kind of look that says "I saw that too," but this is not a safe place to say it. She sent me a message one evening asking if I had 10 minutes. Her wording was neutral. Her punctuation was too careful. We met in a conference room on another floor that nobody used after 6. She closed the door, sat down, and kept both hands flat on the table for a second before speaking. "I should not be doing this unless there is a real issue," she said. "There is," I answered. She nodded once, almost sadly, as if she had already known that. Then she opened a folder and slid 2 printed pages across the table. One was a meeting notes summary she had prepared after an internal prep session Derek held with 2 senior leaders before the executive presentation. Near the bottom, in her objective assistant prose, was a line that made the room seem to narrow around me. "Derek, let's reframe this as my proposal so the room has one owner." I read it twice, then a third time because the simplicity of it was almost obscene. Not a misunderstanding, not accidental drift, a deliberate decision about narrative framing. The second page was even worse. It was an early draft file printout from Packet Prep, the first version rooted for formatting, and buried in the metadata header was my name as original creator. "I saw the discrepancy when I was organizing materials," Hannah said. "Then later I saw the final file with the ownership fields clean. I told myself I was probably missing context. Then I remembered that line from the prep meeting." She looked at me directly. "I am giving this to you because if you go forward without something undeniable, he will turn you into the problem." Her tone was not dramatic. It was practical, which made it more frightening. I asked, "Why now?" She gave a small humorless smile. "Because he thinks the people who move paper don't count as witnesses." Then she added, "And because I watched him humiliate a woman last year by making her sound unstable in a room she should have won." I asked if she would stand behind the notes if forced to. She breathed in slowly and answered with the kind of honesty that only counts because it does not flatter. "If it reaches review and I am asked directly, yes. I am not volunteering before that." I nodded. That was enough. In truth, it was more than enough. I walked back to my desk with the pages in my bag, and for the first time since the executive meeting, I felt not hope, but leverage. There is a difference. Hope is emotional. Leverage is structural. Hope can be manipulated. Leverage changes what the other person is allowed to deny. I still did not move immediately. By then, I understood Derek well enough to know that the strongest case would not be the one where I rushed in with evidence as soon as I had enough to be angry. The strongest case would be the one where I let him tighten the noose himself. So I did something that felt at first like cowardice and later became one of the most disciplined things I have ever done. I became calm. I stopped confronting him. I stopped letting my face change when he took credit in meeting. I answered his late-night requests with measured professionalism. I showed up prepared. I let him feel the return of control. That false sense of safety made him sloppier. He began narrating the theft more broadly because he thought the risk had passed. In one meeting with a VP, he said, "When I designed the retention pivot," and I simply wrote the phrase down. In another, he referred to me as helping support implementation, which was such a drastic narrowing of reality that one director's eyes flicked toward me and then quickly away. He started sending follow-up emails in a more expansive first person. As I designed this approach, the logic I built into the model, my recommendation architecture, each time I saved the message to the folder. Then I set the trap. I sent him a polite follow-up email after a working session with wording so carefully professional, it almost made me sick. I thanked him for the discussion and said I wanted to make sure I was aligning future materials to the right ownership structure. Then asked whether he wanted me to continue developing the strategy framework I originally drafted under his direction, or whether he preferred that I route future changes through him as owner of the design. It was the kind of question that gave him two options, one accurate and one flattering. Derek chose instantly. He replied 12 minutes later, "Please route future changes through me. As I designed this, I need consistency in voice and strategic framing." I read the sentence and felt the air leave my lungs in a long, quiet stream. There it was, the self-incrimination, clear, voluntary, written, after being explicitly given a chance to describe the ownership correctly. He had now taken the work in meetings, in channels, in executive presentations, in naming conventions, in file structures, and in direct email after being prompted to clarify. That mattered because it transformed the issue from slippery office politics into intentional misrepresentation. He was not a manager getting too much accidental credit. He was a person choosing false authorship repeatedly across medium. Once I had that email, I knew the shape of the final file. I built the case like a litigation binder, because anything looser would invite minimization. The table of contents alone took almost an hour. Section 1, timeline of creation and development. Section 2, file origin and metadata. Section 3, version history with marked ownership changes. Section 4, email trail. Section 5, Slack logs and internal chat history. Section 6, meeting notes and calendar evidence. Section 7, witness statements and corroborative materials. Section 8, pattern indicators from prior conduct. I wrote a short summary memo at the front that refused emotion without lying about impact. I did not say I felt erased. I said Derek knowingly misrepresented authorship of work product I created, altered ownership markers in collaborative materials, displaced attribution in public forums, and engaged in retaliatory behavior after I raised concern. Then I listed the proof structure in order: creation before his involvement, his written acknowledgement of my initial framework, subsequent removal of authorship markers, repeated first-person claims of origination, witness note confirming conscious reframing, clarification email, in which he voluntarily reaffirmed false authorship. I knew HR would try to turn it into communication failure, because that is what systems like ours do when confronted with conduct too ugly to process in plain terms. So I built against that move in advance. Each section was chronological, each screenshot was labeled, each email header was preserved, each inference was tied to a specific artifact. By the time I finished, the file was not a complaint. It was a map of cause and sequence. Even then, the night before I submitted it, I sat on the floor of my apartment with the printed copy beside me, and felt a wave of terror so strong I had to press a hand to my sternum. Not because I doubted the evidence, because I understood exactly what happens to people who accuse men like Derek and fail. You do not simply lose one argument. You become difficult, volatile, political, unmanageable. Your excellence gets rewritten as intensity. Your precision gets recoded as resentment. Every future room receives an edited version of you. I thought about closing the laptop and doing nothing. I thought about keeping the file for protection and surviving quietly until I could leave. I thought about how tired I was of carrying the lie in my own body, while he wore it like confidence. In the end, what made me send the email was not courage in the clean, dramatic sense. It was exhaustion. There is a point at which silence costs more than risk. I reached it around 11:14 p.m. with my finger over send. I did not send the case only to HR. That was intentional. I sent it to HR, to ethics, and to Marissa Green, the executive sponsor on the account whose respect Derek prized because she had real influence over succession decisions. I kept the cover email concise. No adjectives, no pleading, no moral language. I am submitting documentation regarding repeated authorship misrepresentation, file ownership alteration, and related retaliatory conduct connected to the retention strategy presented to executive leadership. Because the issue affects both internal ethics and external client credibility, I am requesting formal review. Attached were the memo and the evidence binder. I sent it at 8:02 the next morning and then sat at my desk with my inbox open, barely breathing. HR responded first, as expected, with the soft, flattening language of institutional containment. Thank you for bringing this forward. We would like to better understand your concerns. My concerns. I stared at the phrase and felt a flash of bitter amusement. Then Marissa replied, just one line. This warrants review. I want to see the sequence live. That sentence changed everything. The first meeting was scheduled for that afternoon. HR, ethics, Marissa, and me. Derek was not included yet. The room they put us in was small enough to force honesty, or at least remove some of the theater. HR began by saying they wanted to understand whether this may reflect misaligned expectations around collaborative strategic work. I opened the binder and said, it does not. It reflects a chronology. Then I walked them through the first section, the original draft deck, the local backup, the metadata, the email where I sent Derek the files, his early acknowledgement that I put together the framework, the later email where he called it his design, the version history showing content creation under my account, followed by cleanup under his, the meeting notes from Hannah's prep summary where he said, let's reframe this as my proposal. As I moved through the sequence, the air in the room changed. HR stopped interrupting. Ethics started taking more detailed notes. Marissa leaned forward and asked specific questions, not about how I felt, but about when each shift occurred and whether public credit changes followed private objection. When I described the one-on-one where Derek told me leadership is owning the narrative and warned of professional consequences, HR finally tried to soften it by asking whether he may have meant perception rather than retaliation. Marissa turned to her and said, with a coolness I will remember for a long time, perception does not alter file metadata. Then she looked back at me and asked, do you have any reason to believe this behavior is part of a broader pattern? I said, yes, but I have only partial corroboration beyond this case. That was enough. Once senior leadership smells pattern, the issue stops being interpersonal and starts becoming organizational risk. The meeting ended with Marissa saying, we are bringing this into formal review. On the way out, HR told me not to discuss the matter broadly. I almost laughed. Broadly, as if the last several months had not been the broad dissemination of a lie. I was now being asked to contain more responsibly than the man who created. Confrontation was scheduled 2 days later, though I was not told it would include Derek until an hour beforehand. When I walked into the executive review room and saw him already there, jacket on, expression composed, notebook open in front of him, I felt the old fear punch straight through my stomach and then settle somewhere lower, denser. He looked at me once, carefully blank, and then back at Marissa. The room held HR, ethics, legal, Marissa, one additional executive from operations, Derek, and me. Marissa opened with procedural language, then said there were serious concerns regarding authorship and representation on the retention strategy. Derek leaned slightly back in his chair and began exactly the way I knew he would begin, by widening the frame until accountability might dissolve inside. I'm disappointed this has escalated in a way that seems to misunderstand the realities of collaborative strategic work at senior levels, he said. The tone was perfect, reasonable, saddened, superior. Evelyn contributed significantly to analysis support, but I absolutely shaped the strategy as it moved toward executive action. Analysis support. The phrase was so reductive it almost sharpened me. Marissa said, we are going to review the sequence. She turned to me. Walk us through it, I opened the binder. My hands were steady, which surprised me. My voice was too. I began at the beginning. Original deck creation under my account. Local backup timestamp. Email transmission to Derek with attachments. His reply. Early written acknowledgement that I put together the framework. Slide-by-slide comparison showing my logic structure and recommendation order unchanged in the executive version. Version history snapshots showing my authorship before his revision. Derek interrupted twice in the first 5 minutes, each time trying to reframe edits as design. That proves I refined it. That does not speak to the strategic final form. I kept going. Then I placed the printed prep note from Hannah on the table and read the line aloud. Let's reframe this as my proposal so the room has one owner. Legal asked where the note came from. I identified it as contemporaneous meeting documentation, prepared by an executive assistant who would confirm if asked. Derek's face changed almost imperceptibly then. Not enough for someone who did not know him. More than enough for me. His eyes narrowed by a fraction. His jaw locked once and released. He said, "That line lacks context." I answered, "Then here is the context." I opened the clarification email I had sent him and projected his reply onto the screen. As I designed this, I need consistency in voice and strategic framing. The room went very still. Derek looked at the screen and then back at me. "You baited that response," he said. It was the first truly emotional sentence he had spoken. Not loud, but stripped of polish. I met his eyes and said, "I gave you an opportunity to describe ownership accurately." He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried another angle. "This is exactly the problem. You are treating collaborative leadership language as forensic fact because you are too close to the underlying work to understand how management operates." The operations executive, who had barely spoken until then, asked quietly, "Did you or did you not create the initial framework?" Derek hesitated for half a second too long. "I shaped it into strategy," he said. Marissa replied, "That is not the question." He shifted. "She created early analytical material." I said, "I created the framework, the model, the recommendation structure, and the deck. You did not build it. You edited it." I had not planned to say the line exactly that way, but once it was in the room it rang with a force that even Derek seemed unable to interrupt. He tried. He said, "That is an unfair characterization." I clicked to the slide comparison with tracked language blocks. My sentences, my logic sequence, my labels minimally altered. Then I opened the calendar history, showing I was the original presenter on the internal review before he removed me. Then the Slack thread where I introduced the Central Insight days, before he spoke it publicly in the first person. Then the email where he acknowledged I built the initial framework. Then the later email where he claimed he designed every route he attempted to take out. The file closed. Team effort was contradicted by his first-person ownership statement. Strategic shaping was contradicted by the unchanged core architecture. Innocent formatting cleanup was contradicted by targeted ownership removal. Loose executive language was contradicted by chronological sequence. For the first time since I had known him, I saw Derek run out of narrative faster than he could manufacture another one. He stopped sounding smooth. He started sounding trapped. He said, "This is being framed maliciously." Legal asked, "Is the email yours?" "Yes, but is the version history accurate?" "Partially. Did you say, 'Let's reframe this as my proposal'?" He looked from face to face around the table and seemed to understand, finally, that charm had no traction here because charm requires ambiguity and the documents had removed it. Marissa sat back and said, "Derek, I need you to step out while we continue review." He stared at her, then at me. The look he gave me in that moment held more hatred than anything else he had done, precisely because it was silent. It said he could forgive talent, but not revolt. Then he stood, gathered his notebook with mechanical care, and left the room. He was placed on leave that evening. I found out not from an announcement, but because his meetings disappeared from the shared calendar, and people on his team began receiving rerouted approvals from another leader. The formal investigation moved fast after that, which told me what I needed to know. They found more. Once legal started pulling broader message histories and speaking to former team members, the pattern opened. It was not always as cleanly documented as my case, but enough similarities emerged to make denial impossible. Another analyst had built a pricing structure on a previous account that Derek later referred to in leadership review as the model I developed after rethinking the problem. A former employee described being cut out of a presentation after producing the central framework, then later told She lacked executive presence when she objected. A director recalled Derek insisting that all early drafts route through him before broader circulation because he wanted message control. What had looked like management preference now resembled systematized filtration. There were also complaints, quieter and previously isolated, about retaliatory behavior when subordinates challenged him, about public diminishment, about comments that made people feel unstable for asking ordinary questions about credit and scope. Each one by itself had been survivable. Together they formed pattern. Derek was not a brilliant strategist with messy edges. He was an extractor. He identified labor below him, refined its surface, repositioned himself as origin point, and used the institution's bias toward fluent authority to launder theft into leadership. He had built a career on controlled appropriation and intimidation, calibrated just below the threshold most organizations are willing to call abuse. Within a week, he was terminated. What followed was not triumph. That is the part people outside these stories always misunderstand. On paper, I won. Derek lost his job. My authorship was formally restored. Leadership corrected the record on the account. I was asked to present the next phase of the strategy under my own name. There were quiet apologies from people who had watched and said nothing. There were careful compliments from executives who now spoke my name with a respect that had not existed when respect required risk. One director said, "You handled that with exceptional professionalism," which made me want to laugh and scream at the same time because professionalism had been demanded of me every day of the theft, while none had been demanded of the man committing. Hannah nodded at me once in the hallway, and that meant more than the executive praise. Marissa told me the organization needed more people willing to stand behind fact. HR said the company took integrity seriously. None of those statements healed anything. They floated over the surface of what had happened without entering it. The truth was colder. By the time Derek was gone, the damage was already built into me. I could not walk into a conference room without scanning who had the projector control. I no longer sent editable files upward without preserving shadow copies, time-stamped backups, and explanatory emails from my own account. I learned to summarize ideas in writing before speaking them aloud in rooms with hierarchy. I learned to treat casual praise from powerful men as a possible prelude to absorption. I learned that institutions do not naturally correct toward fairness. They correct only when sequence becomes too dangerous to ignore. That knowledge did not feel like wisdom. It felt like contamination. The day I presented the strategy under my own name should have felt redemptive. Instead, it felt eerie, like walking back through the outline of a disaster after the fire had burned out. The same room, the same screen, different introduction. Marissa said, "Evelyn Carter, who led the design and analysis of this recovery strategy, will walk us through the next phase." The sentence landed cleanly. People turned toward me. I stood, clicked to the first slide, and began. My voice did not shake. The logic held. The recommendations held. Questions from leadership came hard and precise, and I answered them one by one, because I knew the work more intimately than anyone else in the building ever could. From the outside, it probably looked like vindication. A competent woman finally receiving the recognition she had earned. Inside, it felt stranger than that. I was aware at every second of the absence in the room, the shape Derek no longer occupied, the gap where his manipulation used to distort everything. That absence did not create relief. It created echo. My body had spent months learning to brace for interruption, diminishment, strategic misnaming, and the lessons do not vanish simply because the source is removed. When the meeting ended, the COO complimented the clarity of the sequencing model and said it was one of the strongest pieces of strategic analysis he had seen that quarter. I thanked him, then I went back to my desk, closed my laptop, and sat still for a long time staring at my own reflection in the dark edge of the monitor. I had taken the truth back. That part was real. I had forced the institution to see what happened in the only language it could not dismiss, which was proof arranged in order. I had watched the man who tried to convert my work into his identity lose the structure that protected him. I had survived, but survival was not the same thing as restoration. Something more naive in me had been destroyed in the process. Something I could not quite name without sounding sentimental. Some basic belief that excellence and honesty created their own shield if you worked hard enough and documented your thinking and showed up with rigor. They do not in places like that. In places like that, truth must be engineered into visibility. Credit must be defended before it is stolen, not recovered afterward. And once you learn that deeply enough to protect yourself, You do not become softer or wiser or more mature in any clean, uplifting sense. You become harder, sharper, less available to be impressed by title and tone, less willing to confuse fluency with merit, less innocent in every room you enter after. Months later, after the formal correction, after the promotion conversation, after the quiet redistribution of his accounts, and the bloodless company statement about leadership transition, I found one of my original early drafts on an old backup drive. The file opened slowly, and there on the title slide was the version before I had cleaned the wording, before Derek had touched anything, before the office had begun rehearsing the lie. My name sat in the metadata field where it had always belonged. I looked at it for a long time, not with pride exactly, more with a kind of grief, because that file belonged to a version of me who still believed the hardest part of good work was doing it well. She thought if the model was strong enough, and the deck clear enough, and the logic undeniable enough, the right people would see it. She did not yet know how many careers are built by men who wait near the exit of other people's effort and step in front of it just before the room turns to clap. She did not know how quickly offices normalize theft when theft wears the right suit and speaks in the right cadence. She did not know that the people who whisper warnings in hallways are often the same people who will not stand beside you until the outcome is safe. She did not know that documentation would become a form of self-defense rather than good hygiene. I saved the file again in 3 different places, closed the laptop, and sat in the silence of my apartment with the evening light turning the window dark. Derek was gone. The record was corrected. The work was mine again, in every official sense that mattered to other people. But nothing felt healed. There was no clean emotional return. No warmth, no triumphant release, only a colder steadiness, and a private understanding that I had not won back the version of myself this place had taken. He took credit for my work. I took back the truth, and by the time I did, truth no longer felt like justice. It felt like evidence, preserved just long enough to keep one more lie from becoming permanent.